you're accepting the invitation to talk to the group of post-graduation students from Escola Politécnica da Universidade de São Paulo. Romero Tori and Itana Stubiener are the professors responsible for the course PCS 5757, Tecnologias para Educação Virtual Interativa. Okay, now a bit about Tom Arnett. Tom Arnett is from Clayton Christensen Institute. He researches on changing role of teachers in blended learning environments and other innovative educational models. He also studies how teacher education and professional development are shifting to support the evolving needs of teachers and school systems. Additionally, he examines policies and innovations affecting technology access and infrastructure. Is that it, Tom?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, so
thanks for the introduction.
Sure. So take your time, please.
All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you all, and it's exciting to, we get lots of inquiries from people around the world who are, experimenting and innovating with technology and education, and we feel like we have a valuable insights to share for people who are trying to do innovations in education, and it's an honor that you thought to invite us to be a part of this course. Thanks for that great introduction on me. I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit before we get started about the Clayton Christensen Institute and what we are and what we do. Before I dive in that, though, are you able to see now, instead of my picture, do you see the slide I put up with the
Yes.
teacher and the students on the computer?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so at the Christensen Institute, our work really is based on the theories of disruptive innovation that were developed by Clayton Christensen. Clayton Christensen is a professor at the Harvard Business School who's done some very influential and substantial work to help understand, to develop theories that help us understand how innovations evolve and how they develop over time and transform sectors, really. The transformation is basically, making it so that technology can be more accessible and serve and bring, life-changing benefits to greater numbers of people. And he developed a body of theory that explains how that process happens. Back in 2006, 2007 time period, he started doing work to look at how, what insights can we gain from these theories as we look at the education sector. With the hope of how can we make innovation in education more successful and more predictable. And so that's really where our research comes at, is trying to help inform educators, inform policymakers, inform education leaders to help them be successful in the ways in which they're trying to innovate the education system. So now to dive into, what are the conclusions from our work, really to get into that, I need to start with explaining what is disruptive innovation. So disruptive innovation is a term that today often it gets used a lot. It's kind of become a buzzword, and often it gets misused. And the other unfortunate thing is that disruptive innovation often has unfortunate meanings in education. People tend to not think positively when you use the word disruptive in the education sector. But when we use the term disruptive, we have a very specific definition. That is that disruptive innovation is the process by which a sector gets transformed from being served by technologies that are often complicated and expensive and centralized to then having the sector served by technologies that are simple to use and convenient and low cost and accessible to many more people. So to explain this process, I want to talk a little bit about, use the example of the computing industry. So on this graph here, this slide here, there's these concentric circles. And I want you to think of the inner circle representing groups of people with lots of wealth, lots of expertise, and access to new innovative technologies. But as you go into the outer circles, you have groups of people with successively less wealth, less expertise, and less access to technology. So if you think about the computing industry, back in the 1950s, and computing was done solely on mainframe computers. And these were large machines that cost on the order of $2 million US. They took up entire rooms or entire buildings, and because of that, they were largely inaccessible to many, many people. Basically, the only people or organizations that had access to these mainframe computers were large corporations or very well-endowed universities and research institutions. But what we saw in the years that followed, in the decades that followed, was these successive waves of disruptive innovation. So first, the mainframe computers were disrupted by mini-computers. Now, mini-computers, they weren't mini in the way we think of mini today. They were computers that were the size of a file cabinet or the size of a refrigerator. But they were much smaller than the mainframes, and they also were much more affordable. They brought the price tag of computing down from $2 million to just $200,000. And so now many more corporations and more smaller universities could afford to have these machines to do research and to do high-power computation. The next wave of disruption that is often the one that people know best and one that's really interesting was the disruption of mini-computers by desktop computers. What's interesting, though, and what really highlights how disruption plays out is where desktop computers got their start. Desktop computers weren't originally sold as computers for corporations to do high-power computing. They were sold as toys, as educational devices for children, or as simple computers that hobbyists could afford to buy and tinker with. And so, they brought the price of computing down from $200,000 to just $2,000 and made computing accessible to large groups of the population that couldn't afford access to a mini computer or a mainframe computer. But the thing is, desktop computers originally, they didn't have the capabilities of the mini computers or the mainframes. And so originally, corporations weren't very interested in buying desktop computers. But what happened over time is that desktop computers got better and better until eventually they got good enough to do the more sophisticated computing jobs. And at that point, that's when corporations started to purchase these machines, and that's really when the sector got transformed. And the mainframe and the mini computer companies really started to struggle once the desktop machines got good enough to be able to do those more sophisticated jobs. So in the years that followed, we've seen wave after wave of this happening. So after desktop computers, we saw the emergence of smaller notebook computers. And now today, we're in the area of mobile computing, where most people in the developed world have a little computer in their phone that has more computing power than the mainframes of 2 generations ago, but at a fraction of the cost. A mobile phone costs roughly $200 US today, as opposed to $2 million for those early mainframes. So now I want to explain, what is the theory behind how this plays out, how this process plays out. And so again, in this slide, I've drawn these circles that represent groups of people with lots of wealth and expertise in the inner circle, and groups of people with less wealth and expertise in the outer circles. So now on this graph, I want to draw, or on this slide, I want to draw a graph. And on the x-axis, I've plotted time, and on the y-axis, I've plotted performance. And in our research, we've noticed 2 really interesting trends in the evolution of technology on this graph. So the first is this trend right here. This is the ability for customers to use improvements in technology. And the important thing to note here is that it is relatively flat, meaning that the demands that we have for new technologies don't really change a whole lot over time. And the reason is that our lives don't really change that much over time. The jobs that you were trying to get done yesterday are likely similar to the things that you're trying to do today, and are similar to the things that you will be trying to do tomorrow. And so our demands for what we want technology to do, they increase, but they increase gradually. Now, in reality, this is really a range or a distribution. You can imagine lots of parallel red lines at different levels along this plane. And that just represents that different people have different levels of demand. Some people are highly demanding and are never satisfied with the technology, no matter how good it is. And some people are satisfied with just bare technology with basic performance. But no matter which line you're looking at, the trend is the same, that the demand for improvements in technology is very gradual over time. Now, the next trend is the really interesting one. This trend is the pace of performance improvements in the technology. And what you'll notice is that over on the left-hand side of the graph, when technologies are new, they often fail to meet the performance demands of what people would like them to be able to do. But the technologies have this pattern of improving over time until eventually they get good at what like them to do, and then they start to outperform what many customers would like the technology to be able to do. Now, these improvements in the technology, sometimes they're gradual incremental improvements. Think of like a television, television companies going from offering 38-inch screens to 41-inch screens. These gradual incremental improvements. Sometimes these improvements are big breakthrough leaps forward, like television going from black and white to color. But the important thing to note is that whether it's a small improvement or a big leap forward, these technologies have a common similarity, and we classify them as sustaining improvements, meaning that they sustain the improvements of the technology along the same performance metric for the same customers trying to do the same job. Now, in contrast, every once in a while, a different type of innovation shows up in the sector. But before I get to that, it's worth noting that it's usually in this world, in efforts to improve and create sustaining innovations, it's usually incumbent organizations that are really the successful organizations at coming up with what these sustained innovations will be. Because it's established organizations that are best at figuring out what is it that our customers want, what is it that they want us to improve on. Now, in contrast to sustaining innovations, every once in a while there's a different kind of innovation that shows up in the sector. And this is what we've termed a disruptive innovation. Now, the thing to note is that often people think of disruptive innovations as being amazing, drastic changes in the technology, drastic leaps forward in the technology. But really, disruptive innovations, when they start, they don't look like that at all. Disruptive innovations often are not very good along the performance dimension of the original technology, but they offer other benefits such as convenience, affordability, customizability. And these other benefits make the new disruptive technology accessible and appealing to people in these outer circles, people who we term non-consumers, people who didn't have access to the incumbent technology because it was either too inconvenient or too expensive for them. Now they're benefited by this disruptive innovation. And even though the disruptive innovation isn't as good along the traditional measure of performance, it's more than good enough for people who didn't have access, because their alternative was to have nothing at all. Now, true to form, disruptive innovations, once they start off, they go through the same pattern of improvement. And you see that in the upward trajectory of that green line. The disruptive innovations improve over time at serving their customers until eventually they get good enough to be able to do the more demanding jobs of the mainstream technologies that had been served in this inner circle. And that's really where the powerful transformation of the sector happens, is when the people in this inner circle start to migrate out to the outer circle to start to use the disruptive innovations, the disruptive new technologies. The interesting trend here is also that it's usually entrants to the sector that really win at coming up with what these disruptive innovations will be. Now, to give a little more detail to understand how this happens, I'll highlight the pattern of disruptive innovation with the electronics industry of starting in the 1950s. So back in the 1950s, at the core of consumer electronics was this device called the vacuum tube. It looks more or less like a sophisticated light bulb. They were about the size of your fist, and these were the things that powered the amplification in cutting-edge electronics of the time. So we're talking about, floor-standing televisions or large, tabletop radios that were the size of a dresser. So here's just a picture of the types of devices that had these vacuum tubes in them. Now, in the late 1940s, around 1947, Bell Laboratories, which is a research laboratory here in the United States, invented the first form of solid-state electronics, this device called the transistor. And a lot of people looked at the transistor and they thought, wow, this has the potential to transform the world. But the problem with the transistor was that it couldn't handle high-power electronic applications. It couldn't handle the high-power electrical currents that were powering the existing televisions and existing radios. So the leading companies in electronics at that time, which were companies like RCA and Zenith, they all took licenses to the transistor technology. They bought licenses from Bell Laboratories. And then they took the transistor and they put it in their research and development labs. And their thought was, we just need to do invest a whole bunch of research and development into the transistor to get it good enough to do high power electronics, and then we'll just swap it out for the vacuum tubes, and we'll just plug it into the device, the TVs and the radios that we're already selling. So basically, I've drawn this little short blue line to show the trajectory that they were trying to take the transistor on. They wanted to just quickly accelerate it up in performance and make it good enough to do the high power, to work in the high power electronics. Unfortunately, even though they spent over $1 billion in today's money trying to improve the transistor, they never got it to be good enough, and they eventually abandoned the idea of using transistors in their electronics. But it's interesting to see, in contrast, where the transistor did actually get its start. Transistors, as a disruptive innovation, started off, their first application was in hearing aids. And this was really a match made in heaven, because vacuum tubes were too big to fit in hearing aids. They really didn't work for hearing aids. But transistors were small enough that they fit perfectly. And not only that, but the hearing aid didn't demand a lot of power. And so it worked to have a transistor that couldn't handle a lot of power in this device. Now, from hearing aids, the next place where transistors really found their applications was in pocket radios. And in the early 1960s, there was a company out of Japan that at the time no one had heard of called Sony. And Sony came up with the early pocket radios. Now, it's worth noting, though, that the pocket radios that Sony was selling were not competitors with the high-end electronic radios of the time. They weren't competitors with the tabletop radios. The reason was these pocket radios had poor reception. They had a really crummy signal. They were really staticky. It was hard to get the signal to come in clearly. But the pocket radio really offered benefits to a group of non-consumers, to teenagers. Because for teenagers who couldn't afford a large tabletop radio, this pocket radio was perfect. It was something that they could buy on their own budget, and then that they could take and listen to the radio out of earshot of their parents. Really making it so that teenagers could now afford to own and listen to a radio. Now, Sony started off in pocket radios and then moved up into portable TVs. And from there, just kept improving their technology and making more and more sophisticated radios, more and more sophisticated technologies with this solid-state electronic technology, until eventually Sony became a dominant player in the electronics industry. But it's just worth noting that, number one, Sony didn't start off selling high-end electronics. They started off with a transistor in these simple, low-performance electronics applications, and they started off selling these to non-consumers, to people who couldn't afford expensive tabletop radios. And really, the other thing that is highlighted here is that it's not disruptive innovation. Really isn't about. It's not a technology problem, because the leading electronics companies of the 1950s, they were trying to invest in the transistor to make it good enough for their applications, and it wasn't a matter of investment in R&D. It was really about finding what's the right application for the transistor to take off. So now, just to show that this is more than just an electronics thing, on this slide I've got on the left-hand side a list of companies who were really industry leaders a generation ago. And then on the right-hand side are companies that are industry leaders today. And what's worth noting is that the companies on the right-hand side all started off as disruptive innovations relative to the companies on the left. So if you think of Toyota, for example, Toyota today is regarded as having some of the most technologically advanced and most reliable vehicles on the market. But when Toyota got its start in the 1960s, they weren't selling high-end Lexuses and Priuses. They were selling a car called the Corona, which was a compact car that rusted through easily. It broke down a lot, but the real benefit of the Corona was that it was cheap, and it made owning a car accessible to people who previously hadn't been able to own a car. But then Toyota went through the same pattern of improving incrementally over time, and they went from the Corona up to the Corolla, the Tercel, and eventually up to the Avalons and the Priuses and the Lexuses, the high-end vehicles today. In fairness, the General Motors and Ford, the U.S. auto manufacturers at the time, they saw Toyota coming, and they thought, well, maybe we should do something about this new company that's entering our market. And so every once in a while, they would create their own low-end models, their own low-end vehicles. But it was a problem that they never really could prioritize competing with Toyota at the low end of the market, because from their perspective, it always made more sense to invest in the vehicles that made them the most money, the high-end, expensive, sophisticated cars. But we all know how the rest of the story played out, and how Toyota, from starting off as a disruptive innovation, with their vehicles being disruptive innovations, improved over time to become a leading car company of the day. So this has happened not just with Toyota, but across lots of sectors. So today we see companies like Tata out of India or Chery out of Japan coming up with really low-end cars that have the potential to be disruptive to the leading auto manufacturers of today. We also see this in retail, where a generation ago, department stores were the leaders of retail, companies like Macy's, and those later have been disrupted by Walmart and Target, and now we see today the disruption playing out again with internet retailers like Amazon. And so anyway, this same pattern happens in wave after wave across lots of different sectors. So to just make this more concrete, the common characteristics of these disruptive innovations. Number one is that they always start off initially as being not as good along the traditional measure of performance. But they offer other benefits such as affordability, convenience, customizability, or ease of use. And these other benefits are what make them accessible and appealing to non-consumers and to the least demanding customers in an existing market. And then lastly, these innovations all have a technology core that allows them to improve over time until over time they eventually get good enough to do the more demanding applications of the mainstream technologies of the previous generation, which makes them able to serve those mainstream customers. So I've gone on about this theory about disruptive innovation for a while, and you're probably asking, so how does this relate to education? Well, back in 2006, when Clayton Christensen and Michael Horn, who's our executive director, were researching the education sector, they were looking for, what are potential disruptive innovations in education? And they noticed that online learning had the potential to be disruptive in education, the same as PCs in the computing industry or transistors in the electronics industry. The online learning, if you think about it back in the late 1980s or early 1990s, it was really not a really great way to learn, but it offered learning to people who didn't have access to learning opportunities. Now, as we look at K through 12 education, as they looked at K through 12 education in the United States, they saw this problem, though. That was that disruptive innovations always start off serving non-consumption, serving people who don't have access to the incumbent existing technologies. But in the United States, at least, and in many countries around the world, education is provided free to all students, and because of that, there's really no non-consumption of education. But what they noticed was that the disruption that was playing out with online learning wasn't really a disruption of schools, it was a disruption of classes. And if you looked at the course level, there was lots of non-consumption. There were lots of course level opportunities to learn that many students didn't have access to. So in our research over the years, we've come up with this growing list of non-consuming circumstances in education. So one example is students who drop out of the school system. In the U.S., we have lots of students that end up failing their courses and then dropping out of the school system and really aren't being served well educationally. So where a lot of online learning programs started off was creating learning opportunities for these students who had dropped out or who had failed their courses. Another example at the other end of the spectrum are elective courses and advanced courses. Many schools would like to be able to offer advanced courses to their students, but especially for schools in rural areas or schools that are under-resourced, they don't have the budget to be able to hire the teachers they need to offer these courses to their students. So for these schools, offering online courses for their advanced courses or for special electives made a lot of sense because it allowed them to offer something that previously they hadn't been able to offer to their students. So we can go down this list. I won't take the time to go through them all, but as we looked, we saw lots of opportunities of non-consumption of education, of educational opportunities. Mm-hmm. The other interesting thing was looking at the trend of online learning. When we started to look at the adoption of online learning, if you graph the adoption of disruptive innovations, they usually follow an S-curve pattern where adoption is really slow initially, and then at some point it starts to accelerate, and all of a sudden there's very fast and quick adoption of the technology until eventually the whole sector becomes served, and that's when the adoption slows out because the new disruptive technology is now serving the whole market. But when you look at, if you graph that S-curve, it's hard to know where is the technology along that S-curve. Is it starting to accelerate, or is it still in just slow early stages of adoption? But what we can do is we can graph the adoption of the new disruptive technology as a percentage of the total market, and then graph it on a logarithmic scale to linearize that trend, and then we can make projections off of that. And when we did that research, we looked at the trend of online learning, and from that trend made the prediction that by 2019, roughly 50% of all high school courses would be taught online in some form or fashion in the United States. And that's just extrapolating from the data, from looking at that trend to see where it's going. But the trend suggests that online learning was going to have the same disruptive trajectory of adoption. Mm-hmm. So it's important though now to stop and think, what are the implications of this disruption? Disruptions create system change, and what is really the benefit that online learning has to offer as it plays out as a disruptive innovation? And there's a number of benefits that we've identified. One is this idea of personalization. Online, in the education system we have, it was really built on a factory model. The idea of taking a group of students and grouping them together by age, and then putting them in front of a teacher and having the teacher give them all the same instruction was really an idea based off of the factory model of how can we efficiently mass produce education for large populations of people. And this model of education that we've had for over 100 years now has been largely successful at educating masses of people to have basic skills like reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. The problem, though, is that students in an education system really aren't homogeneous inputs like the materials that go into a factory. Students have different learning needs. There's lots of debate in cognitive science and research being done to identify what these learning needs are, and the answers aren't really clear yet. But it is clear that students learn, for example, at different paces. Some learn more quickly than others. And it seems to be that a lot of this stems from the fact that different students have different capacities for short-term memory, and they also have different different knowledge in their long-term memory. They come to learning experiences with different background knowledge. And because of that, just students learn differently. The problem is, though, when you take students that all learn differently and put them through the same sequence of courses, all having to learn at the same pace, the same material, you end up with a system where you have to keep the pace of the instruction fixed, and as a result, the quality of learning that different students get is variable. So some students might pass a course with a 90% or a pass rate, meaning they've mastered 90% of the content. Some students may be only getting 70%. But as long as they're getting at least a passing rate, we let them move along. But when students pass with a 70% or an 80% passing rate, that means that there's roughly 30% or 20% of the content of that course that they didn't master. And as a result, they end up with these learning gaps. And these gaps compound over time until eventually, there's lots of students that end up just feeling lost and bewildered in the education system because they just come to the conclusion that I don't understand math or I don't understand science because they have these big gaps in their prior knowledge. What online learning really enables then is the power to break down and completely transform that system. And with online learning, you can let now students learn at their own pace. And you can take, and instead of having to hold pace of instruction content and let the quality of learning be variable, you can hold the quality of instruction or the quality of learning content by letting the pace be variable and the path of the learning be variable. And this is really powerful. It makes it so that now we can let all students learn in a way that meets their individual learning needs, and then get all students to a high level of mastery. And this is really just the power of really online learning allows us to move to a mastery-based, competency-based learning educational system. The next benefit is that online learning really has a lot of potential to improve teacher effectiveness. And this comes along a number of dimensions. One is that online learning in a lot of settings is used to break up class sizes, to lower the effective class size, because you can have some students learning online while other students learn with the teacher. So now, instead of the teacher having to teach the whole class, they can work on a more individual or small group basis with their students and give them much more focused instruction. The online learning also is getting better and better at capturing meaningful data that it then can report to the teacher, so the teacher can be more informed as they plan instruction for their students. They can have a better, real-time understanding of their students' learning needs because the online learning captures this data about the students' learning. It also allows teachers to specialize. A lot of the really innovative online learning settings let some teachers specialize in instruction, while others might specialize in content development, while others might specialize in small group or individual work with students. And this really allows us to rethink what is the best use of teachers as a resource. Is it really to have the teacher stand at the front of a room giving a lesson to an entire group, or is it to transform our instructional model so that now teachers can fulfill more of these other roles as mentors, as facilitators, as tutors, as evaluators who can really give more high-quality feedback to their students to help in their learning process, or as counselors to help guide their students through the educational system. The next benefit we see is that online learning really helps us unlock the potential for students to become more self-guided learners. When you have our factory-based education system, the system that is common across the world, students end up learning to be passive recipients of instruction because for the teacher to be able to work them all through the same instruction, the students have to move at the teacher's pace. So the teacher is really the one driving the instruction. But with online learning, when students can now learn at their own pace, it gives teachers the opportunity to put students more in charge of their own learning, to help the students set goals, and then make the students accountable for working on their own to meet those goals. And this is really powerful, especially because eventually when all students go to college or when they go off into the workforce, they need to have the ability to self-assess their own learning needs and then to go out and find the resources they need to learn on their own. And online learning can be used to help them develop those skills. The last piece is budgetary flexibility. And this is a benefit that sometimes it seems odd because people think, well, to use online learning, you've now got to go out and buy a bunch of computers or mobile devices, and you've got to purchase licenses to a bunch of software. And that's true. Those are additional expenses. But on the other hand, online learning can be used to free up some of the other resources that are expensive for schools. So in the U.S., we've seen examples where, and particularly there were schools that wanted to open but didn't have the budgetary resources to set up the student-to-teacher ratio that they wanted. They didn't have the budget to hire enough teachers to really run their schools the way they wanted. So they purchased devices and online learning content as a way to be able to lower their effective student-to-teacher ratio, because they could have teachers with larger classes but still be able to give small class type of instruction, because part of the students in the class could be learning through online learning while the other part of the class was learning with the teacher. So a big question, though, that is really worth asking, though, is we've highlighted all these benefits of online learning, but will the online learning fulfill its potential? Well, in general, I think there's a lot of reason to expect that it will. In general, technologies have this pattern of improving over time as innovators try and make the technology better and better at serving the customer's needs. And we can see this happening in education. 20 years ago, the best online learning out there was basically distance learning. It was taking text and putting it online and then having multiple choice assessments graded online. But now we see newer and better online learning environments where they're now incorporating video into the online learning, and video conferencing like we're doing right now. They're also coming up with better software to make the instruction more engaging. For example, the picture you can see on the right is from an online learning course that was it was a video game-based course that was developed by the Florida Virtual School, where they turned the whole course into an online video game where students were trying to solve a mystery that helped them better understand history. So we've seen these innovations over time, where now the technology is also, it's becoming more adaptive, it's becoming more engaging, and it's promising to see where the online learning technology is headed. Now, another important development, though, in online learning is the trend that we've seen, which we've termed blended learning. A lot of parents and families and educators have noted that pure distance online learning really can't serve all of the needs that we need it to serve for students. For one, students, many parents, many families need a place where they can send their students during the day while the parents go to work, and where they know that their students will be safe. So they need a brick and mortar setting to be able to for education to happen. Lots of students also, they like to learn in a social learning environment, and there's a lot of benefits to being able to learn with their peers. And there's a lot of benefits too in a brick and mortar learning setting for teachers to be able to structure the learning environment to really help support students in their learning. And for these reasons, we've really seen the emergence of this thing called blended learning. Now, I'll go ahead and define the term. Blended learning is a formal education program in which students learn at least in part through online learning with some element of control over the time, the place, the path, and the pace of their learning, and at least in part in a supervised brick and mortar location away from home, such as at a school. And then importantly, the modalities along each student's learning path within a course or a subject are connected to provide an integrated learning experience. And this integrated piece is important. The online learning has to be connected to what students are doing face-to-face in the brick and mortar setting. So to clarify what blended learning is, it's also valuable to talk about what blended learning is not. Blended learning is not just taking the whiteboard or the blackboard at the front of a classroom and upgrading it to a smartboard. And it's not just taking the textbooks and upgrading them to ebooks. These technologies can be enablers of blended learning, but by themselves they don't create blended learning, because you can use these technologies without really transforming the way instruction happens, without really moving towards the personalized, self-paced instruction that online learning really has the potential to enable. So in our work at the Institute, we've developed a number of models. We've gone out and observed a lot of examples of where schools are using blended learning. and we've developed this taxonomy to describe different examples of what blended learning looks like. So there's basically 4 models that we've identified: the rotational model, the flex model, the a la carte model, and the enriched virtual model. And then underneath the rotational model, we've identified 4 subcategories of blended learning. And I'll walk through each of these briefly. So the first one's station rotation. This really isn't a new idea because stations have been around in elementary schools classrooms for a long time. But the basic concept is that students rotate between working with a teacher, working online, and then maybe working on some other collaborative or project-based activity with their peers. And this is just a picture to show what station rotation might look like. You've got on the right-hand side, bottom right-hand side of the picture, you've got students working with a teacher, and on the left, you see students at the same time working on the online learning software. The next model we've classified is what we call lab rotation, and this is basically like the station rotation. It's just that now, instead of students moving within a classroom, they're moving from one classroom to another to do online or face-to-face instruction. The next model that we still call a rotational model is the flipped classroom. And this is a really interesting idea. Basically what happens is teachers will take and videotape their lectures and put their lectures online so that then students can go home and watch the lecture. And then they flip the instruction so that instead of traditionally where students get their lectures in class and they go home to do homework, in the flipped classroom they then can do the lectures at home using online learning and then come to school to get their instruction, to do their homework and their practice and really work and get feedback from their teacher. But it's still a rotational model. Students are rotating between online at home and practice in a face-to-face setting at school. The last rotational model is what we've called individual rotation. Now here things start to really look different from the traditional classroom setting. Often you have a large area where students can work and online learning on their own, and then around the periphery of that large learning space you'll have different stations where students can do direct instruction, or they can do, they can get interventions when they're struggling, or they can do group projects with their peers. And students kind of, they learn in all these different learning modalities. The big change here is that in this model, online learning really starts to become the driver of instruction, and not so much a supplement to the instruction. What makes this a rotational model is that even though students may be learning along their individual playlists, moving between these different modalities in an individual playlist kind of way, they still move on a rotational basis. So they'll do 50 minutes at one station and then 50 minutes at another, for example. If you're interested, a school that really is kind of pioneering this model is a school here in the United States in the state of Arizona called Carpe Diem. They've really done a lot of the leading work at developing this model. The next model, and this is now moving away from the rotational models, is something we've called the flex model. The flex model looks a lot like individual rotation in that you've got a big area where students can do online learning, and then you've got these other stations around that room where students can do, breakout instruction with their teacher, or they can work on collaborative projects, or they can, get direct instruction from a teacher. The way that flex really differs from individual rotation is that in a flex model, students are now, they're not moving on a schedule anymore. They move between the different learning modalities according to their individual needs. An example of this is a school called Summit Public Schools here in the United States. And you can see here, this is a picture of what their classroom looks like. And you can see it's very different from a traditional classroom. Often people comment that it looks more like a large open office workspace than a classroom. And students are working on different things at different times and just in a very different setting. One of the ways that you can often tell if you're in a really disruptive innovation blended learning classroom is that you can no longer tell where the front of the room is anymore. And you can see that here in the flex model. The next model, the second to last one, is what we call a la carte. And a la carte really just means often the way it works is that students will be going to a traditional school, and this will be in high school, for example, or in secondary school. They'll go to traditional courses for the first 5 hours of the day, and then maybe for the 6th hour they do an online course on a elective or a subject that their school doesn't offer. They'll take the course at school, and they'll have support at school. They'll have tutors or a learning lounge where they can go work on that course. The big distinction here is that in the a la carte model, the teacher for that course is an online teacher, and the student and the teacher, rarely, if ever, meet face to face. The last model in this among these blended learning models is what we've called enriched virtual. And enriched virtual is really something that evolved out of pure online learning. It's where you take pure online learning and now you start to set up a site, a face-to-face site where students can go in a few times a week and work with a face-to-face instructor. So the last thing to note, after we did the research to kind of classify all these different models of blended learning, a question we asked was, well, are these models disruptive? Are these all disruptive innovations? And the short answer was that some of them seemed to be and others weren't. And that really led to understanding what we call the theory of hybrids. When we look at innovations, often a disruptive innovation, when it enters a market, the mainstream providers of the incumbent technology see the benefits that the disruptive innovation offers, and they want to incorporate it into what they offer. So for example, this is an example from excavation. In the 1950s, excavators were all cable-driven. As you can see here, these cables on this black and white photo. And then in the 1960s, engineers invented hydraulics. And hydraulics were really beneficial because they offered a lot more control of the excavating machine. But the problem was that early hydraulics didn't have the power to lift large amounts of dirt. And so where hydraulics really got their start wasn't in big earth-moving jobs, but really as small devices that could go on the back of farmers' tractors just to dig ditches and small things like that. But then hydraulics improved over time, just like all disruptive innovations, until eventually they got good enough to do heavy lifting jobs. But what's interesting is that back in the 50s, when hydraulics first emerged, there was a company called Bucyrus Erie that came up with this thing called the hydrohoe. Basically, they made an excavator that was part hydraulic, part cable operated, that tried to capture the benefits of both of these technologies, the maneuverability of hydraulics with the lifting power of cable. Eventually, hydraulics got good enough that this hybrid technology really got replaced. But we see this happen where a lot of times the old technology gets incorporated with the new technology in a new hybrid form until the purely disruptive technology gets good enough. When we looked at blended learning, we saw that the rotational models, except for the individual rotation, the rotational models tended to follow this pattern of hybrid innovation, where they were trying to incorporate elements of traditional classrooms with online learning. In contrast, these other models, the flex model, the a la carte, the enriched virtual, and the individual rotation, are they have much more of online learning as the backbone of instruction and have much more disruptive potential. So the last question that people often ask then is, well, which model should you use? Should you use a hybrid, a sustained model, a rotational model, or should you use a disruptive model? And it really depends. The hybrid models are much more reliable, much more predictable, because they're based on that, tried and true, that proven traditional classroom setting. The disruptive models, there's still a lot to be figured out about how to make them work successfully, so they're much less reliable. And for that, you generally don't want to risk, your core instruction, substituting core instruction with a disruptive model. So often what we recommend is if you're looking at a core, addressing core educational problems, like how do you teach math better, or how do you teach reading better, really at this point, it's usually best to start with a sustaining model, to start with one of those rotational models. But if you're looking to address problems of non-consumption, like how do we offer electives or advanced courses that our school isn't able to offer, these are really the prime opportunities for experimenting and developing the more disruptive models, the rotation, the flex model, or the individual rotation, or the a la carte. So that's gone a little longer than I expected, but that's the basic overview of our research. And now I guess with the time that's left, I'd be happy to answer any questions and just kind of get a sense of, I hope this has met you know, the needs and interests of the class. So I'm happy to take questions or to hear feedback.
Okay, Tom, thank you very much. I have a question. I remember when I took a course on blended learning, I remember there are 4 keys to high quality blended learning. One of them is personalization, the other one is expectations, and I don't remember the other 2. And I think they are very important keywords to have a very good or a high quality blended learning.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. You know, when we look at technology, technologies tend to improve to do the things that we demand of them. And so, as you know, as people in education innovate and experiment with blended learning, it's really important to have that clear idea of what are the goals that you want to accomplish. What does high quality learning look like, and how do you measure and how do you make sure that you're getting high quality learning? So that way, when you go to develop a blended learning model for your school or for your students, it helps you be thoughtful and deliberate about making sure you're creating the model not just, you know, for the shiny effect of adding new technology to the classroom, but really to use the technology to focus on those important goals to really make sure it is high quality.
Okay. Another question has to do with the flipped classroom. I very much the idea of having students watch a video at home, and then we have more time as teachers to work with something that is really important and effective for the students in the classroom, right?
Yeah.
Something that really concerns me is, do you have any data of the percentage of high school students or elementary school students who really understand the process and really watch the videos at home? Or what can you tell us about this, your experience about having this flipped classroom style?
So the flipped classroom, you know, because these models are all very new, there isn't a lot of you know, solid academic research on the effectiveness of these models. And in some ways, it's a challenge too to produce that kind of research because, you know, flipped classroom can look very different across different schools, and a lot of it depends on how it's implemented. But anecdotally, you know, we have seen that problem that often schools, they struggle with the fact that sometimes students go home and they don't watch the videos. And so there's a lot of work to be done to figure out, well, how do you make sure that the students are accountable for actually watching the videos when they go home? And how do you make sure that they, you know, that there aren't technical, you know, internet access problems that keep them from accessing the videos? You know, how do you make sure that they're going through the videos in a way that allows them to absorb and really understand the content? So, you know, I've seen as teachers and as school leaders have wrestled with some of those challenges, you know, there've been developments in the technology for, you know, tracking, you know, not just the video is available online, but then finding ways to track the students to make sure they were actually, you know, opening up and watching the video, or maybe embedding like quiz questions in the video to assess and make sure the students are learning when they're watching the video. But yeah, I think that is a challenge with that model, and there's still, you know, a lot of important work to be done to figure out how do you make it work effectively.
Okay, I have one more question before I ask the other students to ask you questions. I know that you have an experience in designing and piloting a blended learning summer school program. What kind of experience did you have? What can you tell us briefly about your experience in this summer school program?
So before coming to the Institute, I worked with a group of schools in Connecticut here in the United States called the Achievement First Schools. And they're schools that you know, are really focused on serving disadvantaged students who, you know, historically have not done well academically, that come from, you know, low-income backgrounds and come from families where often their parents are not well educated. So these schools, they used to have you know, a really robust summer school program where the students would go to school all year, and then they'd get a week or two off, and then they'd go back to school for most of the summer, and then get a week or two off, and then go back to school for the next school year. But they ran into some problems with that model that, their teachers were demanding a lot of their teachers, and their teachers were getting burnt out, and they were also just, it was expensive to hire their teachers to work all year round, and it was hard for their budget. And so they ended up having to get rid of that program. But, they still face the problem that when students go away for the summer, their academic slides, and they forget things, and it makes it so that now teachers have to catch them back up when they go back to school. So, the school had decided we want to come up with some way to offer, to be able to offer summer school, but we can't do it the way we've been doing it. So let's try instead some blended learning program. So I was basically brought in to where they said, we need someone to figure out how to make this program work, to implement it and run it, and then document it so that we can learn from that experience. And so that's what I did. I spent 2 weeks working with the school team to plan the program, 4 weeks doing the summer school, and then a few weeks after that, recording our findings. And some of the interesting things that we learned from that were the power that the online learning gave for students to own their own instruction. So I guess first of all, to explain what we did, we basically did a station rotation model where the students would come to school and then rotate between doing math with a teacher and doing math on a computer, and then doing reading with a teacher and then doing reading on the computer, and they'd be rotating in these small groups. And what we found was that, we started to make the online learning, to make it appealing to students, we had to make it authentic. Meaning that it had to be something that they didn't just go off and do online. It had to be something that we celebrated in the classroom, and that we as teachers were tracking and giving students recognition for the progress they were making when they were working independently online. But the powerful thing was when we started to celebrate the progress students were making and started to make it meaningful for the classroom, we really saw students start to be much more motivated to work through that online learning, because they knew that it was something that was recognized in the social learning environment that they were a part of.
Okay, I like this very much. I like very much the rotate model, but not having only one, like only math, but having other math and reading and writing or whatever. So we can have several things going on in the same classroom. So I think it really empowers the students and motivates the students, right?
Yeah, it really can. It really has that potential.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to ask, Itana, would you like to say something? Itana is the teacher?
Yes.
So here is, oops, sorry.
No, hello everybody. Hello, Tom. My name
hello.
Is thank you very much. I'm a teacher with Professor Romero, and he couldn't attend your speech, but we want to thank you very much to give us this opportunity to interact with you and to learn with you. It was a great time. I was hearing all the time, and I think that's it. Vera did some good questions, and for me it's okay. Thank you very much again.
Yeah, happy to, and thanks for inviting us to be a part of this, of your discussion of your class.
Okay, that's a great time.
Okay. Jessica, would you like to ask some questions? Jessica? I think, well, let me ask Gustavo. You hear us? Okay, Gustavo, please.
Yes, can you hear me, Tom?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation and discussing this with us. It's very kind of you. I am especially interested in the individual rotation model and in the flex models. I would like to know how are the didactic material to support the courses in this kind of models, because I believe there's a guide or book that tells the students what are their tasks. Like they can do that in their own paces, but they have some goals to achieve, right? Which are these materials, and what are traditionally the assessment models and methods?
there's actually a lot of variation, because lots of schools that use a rotation model, there's lots of different ways in which they do rotation, lots of different devices and software that they use. But you know, a good place to look, actually, if you're curious about what are the materials that you use, is there's a website called EdSurge. I'll type it into the chat, actually. EdSurge, if you go on their website, they have a section that is all about different educational tools, and you can go in there and you can look and see lots of different tools, and you can see also the schools that are using some of the examples of places where those tools are getting used. Another thing to look at would be if you go to our website, and I'll type that in here too. We have something called the Blended Learning Universe, or you might see it as BLU. And in there you can go and look at profiles of schools, and you can actually sort it to say, just show me schools that are using a rotation model. And then when you look at the profile of that school, you can see, what is the software, what are the resources they're using. Does that answer your question?
Gustavo?
Yes. Like I believe there's a lot of instruments. I just wanted to I don't know have an example of that kind of tool. And what about the assessment methods? I believe there's a lot of assessment. Like I believe like tests are not usual. Like wouldn't make any sense. But I believe there's the teachers have to really work harder than like teachers in the traditional model to create these assessment methods and these activities, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, so a lot of the software has its own assessment built in, where it will give teachers, as the students use the software, it will assess them, and then it will give teachers reports. Some of the challenge with that is sometimes teachers don't always trust the assessment, or they don't think it's an adequate assessment. But that's just an area where the technology still needs to be improved. And I guess the other thing worth noting is that what we see as being really valuable is moving towards more of a competency-based system, where instead of just giving an assessment to cover a unit of material and then teaching the next unit and giving an assessment on that unit. Really breaking down learning objectives and being able to say, here's the assessment that goes with this specific objective, and being able to measure students' competencies and masteries as they build over time, rather than just giving them grades on passing through the sequence of instruction. And an important piece to that too, and where I think there's a lot of interesting work still to be done, is coming up with performance-based assessments. Some things are easier to assess online than others. It's really easy to do, multiple choice assessments. It's much harder to do, projects or, writing assignments. The software can capture the writing assignment, but still, we don't have software that's good at assessing the quality of students' writing. So, some of that is, there is a balancing of some types of assessment the software can do really well, and some type we still need teachers to be developing and administering. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you very much.
Eduardo, Jessica has a problem with her microphone that is not working. Jessica, would you like to ask a question? You can write, and then I ask Tom. Eduardo, do you have any question? Eduardo, it's okay. Okay. Jessica, not right now. Okay. So I guess, Tom, we are very, very happy, and thank you very much. I think it was very nice. I liked very, very much the part that you talked about the flipped classroom and rotate classroom and flex model. I think these are very interesting ways of innovating your classroom. I know that many teachers are really afraid of trying this type of models in their classrooms, but I think it's a great way of having students more motivating, having students participate in the classroom, and especially I think there is students really need something different. because the traditional way is no longer working in any school. So if we don't try something new, it won't work any longer, because students can learn many things using their own computers, and they don't really need the teachers if the teacher is only in the classroom writing on the board, not paying attention to the rhythms and to the ways students learn, the ways each student learn. Ones are more visual, some are like to touch things. So you have to think about the ways each student learns. I know this is hard, because the teacher has to also be trained to read the data in order to try to work with the students in a very personalized way. But I think it's, as you said, it's a way to go. We are starting this, and I think it's something that really, for me, it's something very, very important and motivates me a lot. So thank you very, very much, Tom, for taking your time to explain all this to us. I think everybody liked very much. And I hope to see you around someday. And thanks a lot for all your marvelous explanation. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay. So, see you.
See you.
Bye-bye. And thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye-bye.